Welcome to MAP, the bi-weekly market access podcast provided by Mars Market Access and Pricing Strategy, which is your healthcare consultancy in the German-speaking markets. Mars makes it as easy as possible for you to get your pharmaceutical, medtech, or digital health product to the market and, of course, get the price it deserves. My name is Stefan Walzer. I'm the founder of Mars and a health economist by training and working in the fields of market access, reimbursement, pricing, and health economics already since 2004. Additionally, I founded the consultancy P&N Pricing and Negotiations in Healthcare based in Toronto, Canada, which supports companies and individuals globally by coaching, simulations, and training, especially on negotiations. This service is including our innovative virtual reality simulation program and is part of the Negotiation Lab. And now let's learn about the market access and reimbursement systems around the globe. Pricing drugs and medical devices and the like is a very complex endeavor. Even though, and especially if you think about the different healthcare systems, maybe in a broader sense, if you say, for example, you have the US, Europe, and maybe Canada, Australia, with similar kind of ideas in terms of health technology assessment and the respective pricing, and Asia. Today we want to focus more on the two big blocks, let's say the US and Europe, with a bit of a focus more on what is currently being happening in the US and which kind of impact that might potentially have on the European pricing of drugs. Just generally, I think to get a kind of introduction, in the US, 64% roughly of health spending are paid by the government and are funded via programs such as Medicare, Medicaid, will be explained a bit later on by Jack, the Children's Health Insurance Program, TRICARE, and the Veterans Health Administration. Very important here also, people aged under the years of 65 acquire insurance via their or a family member's employer by purchasing health insurance on their own, getting government and or other assistance based on income or another condition, or are uninsured. Health insurance for public sector employees is primarily provided by the government in its role as an employer. Why is that important? Especially when you think about the latest Healthcare Inflation Reduction Act, which was just signed by President Biden a couple of weeks ago, which has a couple of important components in there. Besides others, there are a couple of points in there which might also affect prices of drugs. Lower prescription drug prices in Medicare through price negotiation with manufacturers. We're coming back on that point also with Jack and Renato. A yearly cap on out-of-pocket prescription drug costs in Medicare, and the continued lower health insurance premiums through healthcare.gov and the state-based marketplaces. And finally also that the increase in prices for drugs are not allowed to be higher than the inflation currently happening, obviously also in the US. Why is that maybe important? Because, as we have said earlier on, when you set a price for your drug, you have a global launch in mind, meaning you want, as a company, obviously launch the product in the various markets, and hence not only in the US, for example, but also in Europe. What and how is the situation in Europe? As you might know and have listened maybe to different episodes, there is a clear different healthcare system within Europe. We have some countries like France and Germany where the benefit, the added benefit of a product is rather the important component before then it comes to a price negotiation in the whole kind of health technology assessment process, whereas we have other countries where we have maybe more the cost effectiveness, the cost per quality as a core component of it, like the UK, even that they are no more belonging to the European Union, but obviously still are a key country in Europe. And then we have a couple of countries, maybe you could say more driven by budget impact, but ultimately, let's say somewhere between those two, call it extremes. Why is that also important? Because pricing and the price negotiations, especially in Europe, is heavily also dependent on international reference pricing. Meaning, when you go into negotiations, the company has to also show which kind of rebates, discounts have been offered in other countries. And obviously, the payers are also checking would they have and what they can find also as information within their network and publicly available. You could maybe then as well think of, but that's only the Europe, and obviously Europe is primarily looking on themselves. We have enough countries to say, but for sure it's also the question if not the US might also take international reference pricing, especially when Medicare is now allowed to negotiate pricing, at least on some initial products, into account, which could then obviously as well have an impact on the price setting in other countries. Let's see and discuss that with my two guests, Jack Mycka, who was a director on pharma pricing and contracting at Roche Pharmaceuticals. After that, he was a global president and CEO of MME, and now he acts as the vice president pricing, reimbursement, and market access as Indigene PRMA business. Additionally, we have Renato Dellamano, who also acted at various positions at Hoffmann La Roche at a country level, but especially also on a global level, and has been the owner of Value Vector and now is the president of MME Europe. Both have a vast and long-standing experience in pricing drugs and medical devices across the world. So let's just listen in what they think about the current changes and debates in the US and the potential impact on Europe. Okay, welcome Jack and Renato, two of the, how could I say that, the two godfathers of pricing, I would say, right? We learned all from it. We all know you, right? From all of these conferences, etc. So great to have you.
Thank you, Stefan, for inviting us.
Yeah, thanks for having us. And I think if anybody's the godfather, I think it has to be the Italian in the room.
That was not the intention, right? That's perfect. But maybe still, let's say, going back a bit, because I think we want to discuss today, not about the Italy, etc., but maybe part of it. But I think the idea was rather going to the US and also discuss a bit, let's say, latest pricing reform discussions. A lot is already ongoing since a couple of months, maybe even years. So maybe, Jack, you could quickly summarize the latest where we are with the US pricing reform.
Sure. I mean, the big thing that people are talking about from a governmental impact perspective is the provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act that passed back in August. And the Inflation Reduction Act is really primarily driven by other things, not by changes to pharmaceuticals. But there's a chunk in there that deals with healthcare, and the healthcare chunk then deals with pharma pricing, and basically with three main areas that it's going after. Right. The first one is the imposition of an inflation penalty similar to what we already have in Medicaid on Medicare. Medicaid is the program in the US that's for the indigent or poor. Medicare is the program that primarily covers the elderly. And basically what it says is, hey, if with a backdated to January of 2021, if you take price increases that are higher than the increase in inflation, the CPIU, then you're going to have to pay a rebate for the increases that you take above that. So that's, and I'll just kind of run through the three main things, and then we can figure out where we want to go. The second provision has to do with a cap on patient out-of-pocket costs. And what this basically is a little bit of a redesign of the benefit within Medicare that famously for the last few years since Medicare Part D came into place, people have talked lots and lots about the donut hole, the place where there's coverage below and there's a piece where the patient has to pick up the costs, and then they get back into insurance coverage above that. That donut hole is basically being eliminated by these changes, and they're going to be some pretty aggressive caps on patient out-of-pocket expenses that come into play. And then the third big area of reform is that Medicare is going to starting in 2026. Begin to negotiate prices for a limited number of products that are generally near the end of their life cycle, but don't have generic equivalents. So that the discussion that's been going on for a long time about should Medicare be able to negotiate price, which it does not do now, would then change. Those are the three big provisions. There's lots of other things that potentially have big impact, but I'll leave it at that, Stefan, for now, and you can take us where you'd like us to go.
Very good. I mean, as you said, there is already a lot ongoing, and I think the inflation penalty is probably, I think, I would generally see or think. I mean, Renato just comment on that as well in a couple of seconds. I think probably not the biggest kind of potential impact on European pricing as well. Where I see probably the bigger kind of potential impact is on your third point, where we just say Medicare could potentially negotiate prices. I mean, you just said it might only be for a limited number of products, maybe yet. So it's also the question, obviously, how economic might look like in 2026 and beyond. But I don't know. I mean, Renato, how do you see that? Or Jack, please comment as well. I mean,
yeah, and I wouldn't, and I'd tell you, Stefan, don't sleep on the inflation penalty and its impact on ex-US. It's not a direct impact, but there are other impacts. And the other thing that I wouldn't assume is going to happen is that the timing of these changes being passed had to do with them wanting them to be passed before there was the election that just happened in the US, when there was somewhat alignment between the Democrats having control in Congress as well as the presidency, and they wanted to get this law passed during that time, knowing that if the election had gone Republican for the Congress, many or maybe all or close to all of these provisions might never be implemented. We ended up with a split election between the two houses. Something like the negotiation starting in 2026 is not something to assume that will be implemented as written. So from that perspective, I think the inflation penalty as the nearest term, with the backdating, with some of the other stuff that's going on, is easily the most likely thing to happen. And the implications that it has in other ways are interesting. I'll let Renato comment before I take it any further.
Yes, please, Renato. What are your thoughts on that?
Thank you, Stefan and Jack. Actually, I'd say from a European perspective, looking at U.S. pricing, the fact that U.S. prices are a lot higher than European prices is kind of a fact of life. It is part of what people normally accept as almost obvious. And the fact that visible WAC prices in the US are so much higher than visible ex-factory prices in Europe is also tempered by the other kind of, I call it as a piece of common sense, meaning that everyone thinks about that being the right thing. Visible prices are only an approximation, a gross approximation of real prices. And everyone, especially at the national level, truly worries about net prices, not visible gross prices. So if there is a price differential between the US and Europe, that's typically at the visible prices, price level, WACC in US, ex-factory in Europe. That's accepted almost, at least on this side of the Atlantic, almost as an inevitable fact of life. What really is the focus in Europe is the net prices. So a lot will depend on the form that those negotiations will take in the United States and to what extent those forms of negotiations will be possibly transferable to what happens in Europe. On the other hand, I can also see an impact of a recent debate in the United States regarding the quality and the quantity of clinical evidence supporting approvals, possibly affecting the, let's say, the European debate about both regulatory process and health technology assessment processes. In particular, in view of the 2025 a big change, supposedly big change with the introduction of centralized health technology assessment in the European Union. The fact of the matter is that, especially in oncology, with a number of recent prominent cases of drugs that had to withdraw from the US market as a consequence of withdraw individual indications or products that had to withdraw altogether as a consequence of progression-free survival data not being replicated in terms of overall survival benefit, that kind of debate may affect on this side of the Atlantic the debate about the EMA not being flexible enough because our sort of accelerated approval process is more demanding than the one available in the United States. That sort of debate is that is currently ongoing in the United States is likely to affect the European debate in that sense. And knowing that there will be a centralized approach to HTA in Europe, I wonder whether the centralized approach will be taking the form of, let's say, the most severe approaches, like the French refusing reimbursement to a number of treatments simply because of the design of clinical trials. Is it going to take the form of what's going on in Germany with AMNOG, or is it taking the form of what's going on in more general systems, like paradoxically Italy, in which we have several products, several drugs that have been refused reimbursement in France or that had to be withdrawn from the German market post-AMNOG. They are available and reimbursable in Italy. Personally, I believe that if there will be a common denominator in the European Union, that will be closer to the most demanding health systems. But again, it's difficult to predict this, but I can only say, there are a number of factors that possibly will make our, let's say, innovation life tougher in Europe in future than it is today for a number of reasons.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, very, very interesting. I still want to touch base a bit on the negotiation bit, and I'm coming back, Jack, I think, to your comment as well with the potential indirect impacts of that Inflation Act, which I think might also be interesting, obviously, for all of us. But if I would think out of, let's say, negotiations from a European perspective, I would always as well think about, let's say, reference prices, right? Reference prices from other countries. Do you think that might be something could also be taken into account in the US, at least for some prices from, I guess, Canada? But then you have only one country, so maybe still other kind of countries out of Europe.
I guess it's possible. I think I bring it all back to the fundamental statement that Renato made that I think this is all built upon of, well, we all know US prices are higher than prices in the rest of the world. Well, I think the people who know that least of anybody are the people in the US historically. And now that they know it, I don't know that they're so happy about it. And from that perspective, I think this isn't a short-term game. This is a long-term game. And I equate it, if anything, to be most similar to the Germans pre-AMNOG saying, hey, we don't mind paying the highest prices in Europe. We just don't like that our prices are have as big a margin higher than they are. And look at how that has progressed and changed over the last few years. Think of fundamentally that same kind of effort, obviously done in a different way, applying to the US and how that would reshape the biopharmaceutical markets around the world. If the US says we're not willing to subsidize the rest of the world because that's what we feel like we've done, and therefore we're going to go at this differently, that's going to change things significantly. And my guess is that trying to do that through international reference pricing is, given that, as Renato said, list price isn't the goal anymore in Europe, it's net price. Well, then what are you referencing? And certainly at the beginning of the AMNOG reforms, my impression from talking to people was that by talking about net prices being visible in Germany, one of the ideas was maybe that'll lead to a change and everybody will reveal their net prices, and then we'll pierce the veil of this international reference pricing at a gross price level, and nobody followed. So that didn't happen. So it happens behind the scenes in different ways. But that's what I mean about understanding that I think this is folks playing a long game, not a short game. So it's not a question of which products can I grab today and negotiate price on. That could certainly provide a good short-term gain, but that's not going to necessarily solve the longer-term problems that I think people are most concerned about.
Yeah. No, absolutely interesting. Renato, what do you think about that? I mean, especially when we take, and Jack, you brought that also already up. Obviously, it's not only about the systems speaking to each other, if I want to say it like that, right? It's also around the companies obviously planning for their, global launches, global pricing strategy, et cetera, where I would also agree that I think at least, the years I have also been working on the global level, it was basically the US, and then you had the rest of the world, and within the rest of the world, you had maybe EU5, right? And then you had, really the other kind of countries. But I mean, if I would, follow more your kind of idea as that being a long-term game, where I agree, would we not rather see a kind of, convergence of prices around the different countries, at least between Europe and the US, probably more on a much lower level at the end of the day?
If I can make a comment from a European perspective, I'm not sure that convergence is really going to happen. Perhaps we are going to have less large differentials at launch, because then the other thing that we need to consider is the possibility of changing prices post-launch. Especially in Europe, those changes only happen in one direction, and that's towards lower prices post-launch. I don't know if the reform in the United States will eventually result into the abolition of price increases over time, or will just put a cap on the level of annual price increases that can be brought forward, as to some extent is already true these days, at least for certain price levels. But I can still see launch prices being still different, with the US being still significantly higher than Europe, maybe not to the extent that we are seeing these days, especially in oncology. It's amazing looking at new oncology drugs being launched in the United States at prices per month, talking about visible WAC prices in the ballpark of $30,000 to $35,000 per patient per month, and the same products being launched in Europe, even in Germany, pre-Amnog at less than half, and then obviously post-Amnog going even further down. Probably that kind of price differentials maybe will no longer be tolerable in future. And then the other thing is, how will price evolution change on the two sides of the Atlantic? I don't know that is going to change significantly.
And I think Renato is right in what he's talking about, but at the same time, I think that's where I go back to what I was alluding to, Stefan, with don't sleep on the inflation penalties impact in the short term, because I think the big impact of the inflation penalty in the short term for manufacturers is it turns up the heat on, you better get your launch price right. Because if you don't get your launch price right, you're not going to have the chance in the US, as occasionally is done. Wow, this product is much more valuable than I thought it was. So therefore, I'm going to hit it with price increases on a pretty regular basis and take it to a different level. Can't do that anymore. Once you can't do that anymore, that means you better get it right the first time. And that then draws into question, as Renato's saying, okay, what kind of gap am I going to have in this launch price? What am I going to do? Am I going to sacrifice the premium that I think I can get in the US so that the prices are more level, or am I going to do whatever I can do in order to increase the prices outside the US in order to make those prices more level? That's not entirely clear, but that's the vice that's going to be squeezing a lot of pharma companies, I think, in the short term.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Absolutely. I mean, if I, let's say, let's say, turn that probably even a bit further. I mean, if I would say I have the products on the market where I can fully understand it. I mean, as you just said, I mean, I can only increase the price in the US according to the rate of the inflation. Makes in a way sense, at least from a European perspective, right?
It does from a US perspective too. That doesn't mean that markets have performed, but it makes sense. I'm with you. The logic is there.
Exactly. But I mean, if I would be now in the, let's say, shoes of a company which is just planning their launch, as you said it, right? Get your launch price right at the early beginning. Would that not mean that ultimately, let's say, the whole healthcare systems and the payers would at least, let's say, need to pay in the short-term future higher prices because everybody's anticipating that as well?
Potentially, and I think it ties back to what Renato said before. It also increases the need for those companies to figure out what their endpoints need to be and what kind of clinical data they're going to have to bring in order to support that product and that price that they're asking. I think, I think there's a lot of variability in how companies go at that and what they do, and that variability on the weaker side is potentially putting them in a position as we're moving forward, not to get out of their assets what they expect to get.
Yeah, we are always back to the value basis for pricing. Pricing cannot be established independently from the value proposition that's behind the product, that's behind the new therapy. And that value proposition critically depends on quantity, quality, and credibility of clinical evidence, which is brought forward when the manufacturer goes to the payers, goes to the health technology assessment bodies, and tries to demonstrate its point. If I come with overall response rate and cannot translate that overall response rate into overall survival, the value proposition is undermined.
That's true. Even though obviously we all know, I think there are maybe areas where it's getting really tricky, right? Think about the 18 piece or so, right? Where you only have really a very low number of patients. Having heard what you said just, Renato, right? Especially with the, let's say, withdrawals of products also in the US. And some we have also seen in Europe, but I think not to that extent yet. What do you think would that basically mean from a clinical development perspective, especially in those areas? Think about those cell therapies and generally of those ATMPs. They're not getting it even more tricky. Maybe we're even blocking a bit that kind of development for the future.
Well, especially if you look at the area of cell and gene therapies, there have been a couple of very prominent cases also recently with Bluebird Bio withdrawing from Europe.
Yes.
I don't know that they'll be successful in the US to the extent that they need to, but we'll see. They are now close to, they have got a couple of gene therapies approved in the United States. We'll see when they'll be truly on the market with those gene therapies. We'll see if they can make a better case in the US than they were able to make in Europe. But that's only the tip of the iceberg, because there are other prominent cases like you may remember GSK actually divesting a whole portfolio of gene therapies to Orchard Therapeutics, and Orchard Therapeutics now having to divest a number of products from that portfolio that they inherited from GSK because, again, they cannot make business sense of that portfolio of gene therapies. So there seem to be some specific issues with the number, let's say, with the most demanding kind of therapies like gene therapies. It looks like, again, looking at the relatively limited number of successful launches in this field, including launches of CAR-T therapies, it looks like having those products incorporated into a much broader portfolio allows a greater level of sustainability of being in that business. Novartis is apparently quite happy with their launch of Zolgensma, their launch of Kymriah. So probably probably it's a lot easier to achieve commercial success also with the most demanding therapies like gene therapies if you have the infrastructure and the support that you can have within a much larger corporation. Smaller companies are struggling a lot more. Again, example of Bluebird Bio, Orchard, compared to what's going on at Novartis. I think that's very telling. And Jack, I'm not sure to what extent that is possibly different, going to fare a different way in the United States than it fared in Europe. I don't know.
I mean, I think I think in some ways it has a lot of parallels to kind of the early days to the not quite so early days of rare disease, where you at the beginning you kind of had people say, wow, this is great, we've never had treatments for these diseases before, let's figure out how we can support them in the market. And I think the same thing generally has happened with cell and gene therapies. And you started to have people say, well, wait a minute, what is this for and how does it work, and am I getting value for it, and where do I go? And then you started to see the people evaluate them in a different way. And also, there's a lot more flexibility for somebody to say, how does this fit within my portfolio and what can I do with it, than it is for somebody to do it, launch it, make a success of it when it's their only asset. There's those things are just fundamentally different. And that doesn't mean it can't work as a single asset. It can, but you don't have as much flexibility around what the issues are that you're going to work out once you're really trying to do it, as opposed to what you have to work out before. So I think, I think the issues are real. And at the same time, I hope that the healthcare systems that we all live in and is a part of figure out a way to bite off, chew, and digest these therapies where they offer value and where they can really help people, because there are a lot of them that really can. I know, for instance, I mean, I've done cell and gene therapies, worked on them as a consultant for people where there have been tens of patients, and I've worked on other ones where there are tens of thousands of patients. So even within that umbrella, they're not the same.
No, absolutely. Perfect. I think that was a good kind of, let's say, end of a discussion. I think we started very, let's say, broad from a US European perspective, and then went into some of the more kind of real issues also around ATMPs. Thanks a lot, Jack, Renato. It was a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Stefan.
Thanks, Stefan.
Great insights from Renato and Jack on the current debates in the US and the potential impact, or maybe not, in Europe. I think what was probably also important and interesting is especially to see how both have tried to, let's say, learn, let's maybe call it like that, from history. I think there were different environments already happening where some experts have already seen the risk that prices will and could have been significantly decreased some years ago. But currently still, it's a bit of a question. I would like to quote as well what Jack said. It's maybe a long-term game where I think he might especially refer back to the negotiation opportunity for Medicare. And we have just heard in the introduction that still a vast majority of patients and the population is being served by Medicare and Medicaid and other governmental environments. So why is that important? Because, at the end of the day, there might be a start now with some limited number of drugs close to being generic, but no equivalents yet available. So maybe more in the direction of potential biosimilars, where those have maybe not yet entered the market. But very important, Jack and Renato also just said both, look what happened with Germany those 12 years ago before AMNOG. That was also, let's say, the kind of idea, yes, we are happy to pay maybe more, but we're not happy to pay that much more. And that's what we see currently in the public debate in the US. So it could very well be that the current kind of, let's say, start of such negotiations could really be the start of a longer-term kind of project, meaning that Medicare, Medicaid, maybe also other payers, especially governmental payers, might be able then to negotiate prices further down. And what and which kind of, let's say, tools you might have. I think Renato is still more the opinion that the added value, so the evidence base of a drug of a product would still be more important and will be still the key driver of pricing and price negotiations. However, I think there's still a bit of a risk, at least, that payers would also look at other markets, at other prices, hence include also, and even in the US, an international reference price system. I think it would also be quite evident that this would and could not only be, for example, Canada, and for sure not South American countries. So it would be probably more looking into other similar kind of, if you can call it similar, kind of countries like the UK, maybe also Australia, but then you're probably suddenly back also to at least some of the European countries. Why is that important? Just keep in mind the US has such a huge population, which might also be then the kind of case that some companies might drill and change the price, that it might still optimize the revenue in the US, which could potentially be too high for some of the other markets. So let's just see. I think at the end of the day, both Jack and Renato probably agreed that at least in the short and midterm, such a kind of effect might not be seen. That was an episode of MAP, the Market Access podcast provided by Mars Market Access and Pricing Strategy, which is your healthcare consultancy in the German-speaking markets. MAP is available every second week with a new episode, so watch out. And in case you might have questions, contact me directly and or visit our website on www.marketaccess-pricingstrategy.de.